Hello makers, Ruth here. In this video, we're going to be creating some macrame. Now, macrame may be something you've heard of before. It may have even been something that you've done before. But I do want to say, if you have never done any type of macrame before, this is a good place to start. This is a good project to begin with. What we're going to be doing is one knot over and over and over again. So it's a really good first step into the world of macrame. So macrame actually comes from the Arabic word meaning fringe. And we can see by my examples here that that makes a lot of sense. But we can see examples of macrame all throughout history. We see it in antiquity by looking at Assyrian and Babylonian history. We can see it in Arabic textiles from the 13th century. They tie off the woven ends to make this decorative binding. We see it in Victorian times in the decorative arts, decorating the wall and the tables. Sailors all over the world use macrame to make things like hammocks and netting. Macrame it was used everywhere, all throughout time, basically. It rose to popularity and in popularity in the US in the 1970s. And now we're seeing this really wonderful resurgence. Macrame is becoming popular all over the world again. We even can see it in some art museums and galleries, which is kind of cool. One of the things that I really like about this macrame process is that it's a very versatile practice. It has a lot of uses, and we can see that throughout history. And it has a really long history. And I always think there's something really nice about taking part in an art practice that so many people have done throughout time. It's just a really wonderful way to connect to history, right? In such a beautiful way. Another thing that I really enjoy about the macrame practice, art practice, is that because of the repetition, because you're repeating one knot or a few knots over and over and over again, that repetition can feel soothing. So it makes this macrame practice a very meditative practice. Now, if we're trying it for the first time, learning a new technique, sometimes we don't find that meditative. Sometimes that feels a little stressful or tense. But the more we practice it, the more we do this, the more confident we'll feel in our nodding, and the more comfortable we'll feel in just enjoying that making process, right? So then we'll be able to really experience that meditative and mindful quality. All right, so let's start talking about what we're doing today. So these are a couple examples of the keyring that we'll be making. It is a feather or leaf type shape, whatever you want it to be, basically. And you can see my examples here. I have three different sized macrame cording. So you can do something that's really thin. You can do something that's much thicker. And the truth is, you don't even have to use macrame cording. You can use a really thick yarn. You can go to the home supply store and get rope. You can use clothesline. There are so many different things that you can use in place of macrame. So don't feel trapped by having to use just macrame cording for macrame. We can be creative with the supplies we use, definitely. So I just wanted to show a couple examples before we get started. Let me move these out of the way and let's talk supplies. So the first supply that we need, that we'll need every week, are illustrated instructions. The one we're doing today is the macrame keyring. Now this wasn't included in the kit. However, if you look in the welcome packet, there's a link to our resource page. And that resource page has all of our illustrated instructions, and you'll be able to find this one there. And just like all those other illustrated instructions, they're all laid out the same way. That list of supplies at the top, and then that process is laid out step by step. I'll be following along with this today, guiding us through that process, but it's always nice to have that on hand where we can take notes and use it as a reference. So if you have it on hand, go ahead and pull that out. The next supply that we need is going to be found in our kit, and it's going to be our macrame cording. We're going to be using a white macrame cording, and the reason for that is so we can embellish it however we want. So I have a couple examples here of cording that I have painted or dyed. I used watercolor for one, and then used fabric dye for the other. You can also use acrylic paint by watering it down a little bit. You can add in beads or charms. You can add different types of cording. Add a little yarn or embroidery floss in there as you're doing those knots. There are so many ways to embellish, but because there are so many ways to embellish, that's why we're starting with the white. However, know that if you do want to do more macrame, you can get cording in almost any color. There's so many options out there. But we're going to be using the white today, and it's going to be found towards the bottom of your kit. And then the last thing we need out of our kit, we just need two supplies today, the cording and the key ring. And the key ring is small, so it's going to be found inside that Ziploc bag. All those tiny supplies that we're going to be using throughout this series are going to be in that Ziploc bag, and that key ring is one of them. So go ahead and pull that key ring out. We'll be using that today. Now we do need a supply that's not included in the kit, and that's going to be a pair of scissors. We're going to be cutting our cording into strips at the beginning, and then we're going to be trimming our piece at the end. So we'll need those scissors a couple times. So definitely pull out a good pair of scissors. Now there are a couple supplies that are helpful, but not absolutely necessary. And those supplies are going to be some tape and a marker or pencil. Now I'm using some painter's tape today, but you can use any type of tape you have. It's Scotch tape, packing tape, duct tape, masking tape, any tape will work. We're just going to be using one small piece to kind of hold down our key ring as we're tying knots, so kind of keep it in place. It's helpful, but you don't have to have it. And then for that marker or pencil, we're going to be using that as the end to help give us some guiding marks on where to cut, where to trim our piece. Again, not absolutely necessary, but it is helpful. So just to recap the supplies that we need, there are just a few of them today. It is the macrame cording, the key ring, and the scissors. All right, so let's go ahead and start our process today. I'm going to move this over a little bit. Actually, no, I'm going to bring it back because the first thing we're going to do is cut our macrame cording into strips. You'll see in the supplies, it says that macrame cording, we need to cut it into 13 10-inch strips. Now, this is not exact. It can be around 10 inches. I have just found that the 10 inches is easier for me to handle and to knot. And so that's why the 10 inches is there. You can do a little more or a little less. And I have 13 of them listed on there. You don't have to have 13, but you do need an odd number. And the reason for that is because when we're tying our knots, we're going to be using two strips all the way down, but we need one strip as that center cord, right? And so we need that odd number. So if you end up cutting 14 strips or 12 strips, pull that last one out. We're going to kind of set it aside because we need that odd number. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and pull out a ruler. Go and cut. Where's the 10? There's a 10. And cut about 10 inches. Okay. So I'm just going to go ahead and cut all my cording up into those strips. And you can see that I'm not being super exact. I'm doing them at sort of the same length. That's also one thing I really like about this practice is that it doesn't have to be exact because we do the trimming in the end. So it doesn't have to, we don't need it to be exact. I also want to say you may start to notice that your ends are starting to fray a little bit. Know that that's okay. We want it to fray in the end. So the fraying is good. And at the same time, we're going to be trimming anyway, so it doesn't matter, which again is another perk of this process. So go ahead, if you're following along, cut your strips. And I will say, if I am moving too fast, always feel free to pause the video and rewatch as often as you need. All right, so I'm just cutting all my cording up. All right, and so I've got 3, 6, 9. I have 14 strips, and I'm not sure how I got it. So I'm just going to take one strip and set it aside so I can have that 13, that odd number. You may get less, you may get more, or fewer strips, you may get more strips. Again, we just need that odd number. All right, so once you have your strips cut, let's take that first strip and we're going to fold it in half. Right? And so we're going to be following along with those illustrated instructions just so just so we can kind of see where we are. But that first strip, we're going to fold it in half, and that's going to be our center strip. Right? And so that next step that we see in those illustrated instructions is to add that key ring to the loop. And so I've got my key ring right here. Now you can add it to the loop or to the strip in a couple different ways. You can just tie it on if you want, just tie a little knot. Or one of the things that I do, and I'll show it a couple times, is I'll take, need some nails to pick it up, but I'll take my key ring and I'm going to thread my cording through that key ring, going under and then over, right? So what it looks like is I'm taking the cording and threading it through, coming from the bottom up to the top. So it looks like this. Okay, so I'm going to show that again. I'm taking that cording, taking the cording and threading it through, going from the bottom to the top. So my loop is sticking out. So my next step is I'm going to reach through that loop and pull that keyring up. Okay, so that gives me a nice little knot to start. I'm going to show that again. So once we take our keyring and we thread our loop through from the bottom to the top, threading it through that keyring, I'm going to reach through that loop and pull that keyring through. And that gives us our starting knot. So definitely feel free to rewatch that as often as you need. I know sometimes doing that start knot can be a little a little difficult. But now that we've got that key ring on the end, I'm going to take a piece of my tape here. Maybe take a piece of the tape. There we go. And I'm just going to tape down that ring. We don't need a big piece, but what that tape is going to do is help hold it still while we're tying our knots. Again, if you don't have tape, it's totally okay. It's not absolutely necessary. It's just a little helpful when tying those knots. So our next step is actually to tie the knots. And so you can see we're going to be doing step 3 through 6, and then just kind of repeating it over and over again. So that first step is to take our 2, we're doing it 2 at a time. So I'm taking 2 cording and I'm folding them in half. Okay. And I'm going to be following along with the images here. Okay. And so I'm going to start by taking that first one, that loop, and I'm going to take it under my center strip. So it looks like this. I'm starting on the left side, and with that loop, I'm putting it under my center cording, my center strip. So now my tails are on the left side, and my loop is on the right side. Now, the truth is, it doesn't matter if you start with the left side or if you start with the right side, because we're doing the same knot all the way down. We're just flip-flopping which way we start, right? So I'm starting on the left side, but feel free to start on the right side. We're just going to alternate as we go down. So again, I'm taking my cording, folding it in half, starting on my left side. I'm going to go under my center strip so that loop is sticking out. right? So it looks just like our picture here. In the next step, we're going to start from the right side and thread it through. So what that looks like is taking that other folded cording, we're facing it the opposite direction here. So I'm starting on the right side and I'm taking that loop and I'm putting it under that first loop. Right? So I'm taking that loop, starting on the right side, and oh, putting it under the first loop. Then I'm going to take that same loop and put it over my center cording. So I'm going under the first loop, over the center cording, and then under the tails. So it looks like this. Right? So we're doing under, over, under. I'm going to repeat that. So with that second folded cording, we're starting on the right. We're taking that loop, putting it under the first loop, putting it over the center cording, and then putting it under the tails. We're doing that under, over, under movement. So now we have this nice knot. We have tails facing both sides. And so what I'm going to do is take all the tails and just pull them. And then scooch them up. Now, scooch is that technical term. We're just kind of pushing it up, pulling those cords, those tails tightly, and then pushing it up. Now, the one thing I want to mention is you don't have to push that knot all the way up to the key ring. You can leave a gap if you want. You'll notice in my examples that I have one that's really close and one that's further away. So feel free to put that knot, that starter knot, wherever you want it to be. There's no rule of where it has to be. So that's our first knot. That's it. We're just going to repeat that all the way down. The only difference is that we're alternating which side we start with. Okay, so I'm going to take my next two strips here, fold them in half, and I'm going to start with the right side now. So I'm taking one of them, right, with my right side, and I'm going to do the same thing. Take that loop and put it under my center strip. And with that second cording, I'm going to start on the opposite side, the left side. I'm going to go under that first loop, over that center cording, and then under the tails. So I did it the opposite way. At first, I started with the left side. And so on this row, this knot, I'm starting on the right side. So you can see when I pull the tails and kind of scooch it up, you can see that knot is kind of alternating. So let's repeat that. Let's get two more strips. Again, I'm taking two strips, folding them in half. And because I started on the right side, I'm going to start on the left side now. Now you may be like me and get distracted somewhat easily. And so sometimes I can forget which side I started on. So it's hard to know which one, like how to start my next knot, right? So a little trick that helps me is if you're following along with these instructions and you start on the left side, if there's an even number, that means that next row is on the left side. If there's an odd number, that means it's on the right side. Right? Left is even, right is odd. And that's only if you start your whole key ring on the left side. Right? So because I have 2 knots, that's an even number. So I know I'm starting on my left side. Right? So I'm going to take that cording that's folded in half, and again, do the same thing I did with the other 2 knots, taking that loop, putting it under my center strip, and then taking my next cording, next strip, and putting that loop, I'm starting on the right side with it, taking that loop and putting it under that first loop, putting it over that center cording, and then putting it under the tails. That under, over, under. And as you can see, like what I'm doing is I'm not doing anything in a rush. I'm not pulling it quickly and shoving it up quickly, but I'm taking my time pulling the knots, making sure everything's straight. This doesn't have to be a fast process. I also want to say, you can see with mine, those knots aren't pulled too tightly. I don't have a lot of strength in one of my hands, and so it's hard to kind of grip it. Know that it doesn't have to be super tight. We're just pulling those tails as tightly as we can, and then kind of pushing them together. So let's go ahead and start our next knot. And remember the trick I was sharing. If you start on the left side, you start your project on the left side. If there's an even number, that means you start your next row on the left side. If there's an odd number, that means you start your row on the right side. So I can see I have odd number of knots. I have 3. So that means I start on the right side. So I'm going to take my folded cording and just put it under that center cord. And then take the next one going from the opposite direction and put it under that first loop, over that center cording, and then under the tails. And then again, we're pulling it tightly. And you can see too, as I'm pulling mine tightly, that my edges are all over the place. That's okay. Because we're going to be trimming it, no one's going to see those off edges. I also want to say, you may notice that we've got long, like some length on each of these sides. 10 inches may feel like a lot, but I have discovered that it's just the right length for my hands. So if you can handle smaller lengths, smaller strips, definitely do smaller strips. But at the same time, no, if you need longer strips, that's totally okay too. We're going to be trimming those edges, so no one will ever know. So I'm going to go ahead and do my next 2 cords. I have an even number of knots, so I'm starting on my left side. I'm taking the loop and putting it under my center strip, and then coming the opposite direction and putting that loop under my first loop. Under, over the center strip, and under the tails. And you can see I'm coming close to the bottom of my center strip, and I still haven't used all my cording. So know that you don't have to use everything you cut. You can if you want to, but you don't have to. I think I'm going to stop here. I think doing another knot may be too close to the bottom for me. So I'm going to go ahead and stop here. I'm going to set those 2 cords aside. So I've got my finished piece, let's say, the knots all the way down. One of the things that you'll maybe notice is that if you're like me and you can't pull it too tightly, that the knot sometimes on the bottom will slide. One of the things that you can do is add a little dot of glue in that last knot to hold it to the end. Now in your kit, we don't have any tacky glue or Elmer's glue, but we do have the Mod Podge. Mod Podge is an excellent art supply. It's an adhesive and a sealant. We're going to be using it for both of those things later on in this series. But if you want to take just a little bit of that Mod Podge and just put a little drop on your knot, you can see that it's white, but it dries clear. So that's nice. So I've got that knot there, and I'm going to let that glue dry. And while it's drying, I'm going to go ahead and start my trimming. Now this is where that marker or that pencil comes in handy. Let me pull my illustrated instructions over. So that last step is to trim the edges and fray the ends, right? And so you can see in this illustration that I have a dotted line kind of at an angle. So you can see it kind of gives me a guideline on where to cut. You don't have to do it. You can wing it, do it by feel. Those are good. All are good. But that marker can be a little helpful, or that pencil. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to use the marker. I'm using black, so it's easier to see, but a pencil works just as well. But I'm going to make that angled line. I'm not going to start at the knot. I'm going to start a little bit away from that knot. And I'm just going to kind of make that mark all the way up. Okay. So it's not a super straight line. It's kind of the angled line. I'm going to go over to the other side and do the same thing. Not starting at that knot, but starting a little bit over. And then just kind of drawing that mark all the way up. You can see mine's a bit angled. That's okay. We can always trim it again if we need to. So the next thing is to go through and cut. So I'm just going to kind of take my time. And cut those pieces. So you've got a nice little angle here. I'm going to go to the other side and do the same. Just kind of cut using those pencil or marker lines as a guideline. And then I have my tape holding it in place, which can be helpful. Now, after you trim, you may be like me and notice you didn't cut straight, or they're a little off. Know that you can always go back and trim again if you want to make it look more similar, or you can trim at the end. Our next step is to fray those edges after we cut. So you can use, in your kit, there's a tapestry needle. That tapestry needle is going to be found in that Ziploc bag. It's stuck in the paper of the embroidery floss. It's got a sharp point, so it'll work perfect for fraying the edges. You can also use a pencil, like I am, a needle, an ice pick, skewer. There's also a skewer in your kit that will work as well. You need something that has a little bit of a point, because what we're going to be doing is kind of fraying those edges. So I'm just taking my pencil. I'm using one hand to kind of hold the knots. I'm just taking my pencil, kind of brushing the hair of my key ring here. I'm just kind of running it through, fraying those edges. And you may notice as you're doing your fraying that as you're fraying, your cording looks like it's growing, right? You can see that the cording is tightly wound, but as we unwind it, it's taking up more space. That's good. That's what we want. We want it to have that feather-like shape or that leaf-like shape. And so just kind of go through and fray all those edges. You take your time with that cording. And this works for, when you're using yarn instead of macrame cording, or rope instead of macrame cording. If you want to use something like other material, like maybe fabric strips or something like that, you won't be able to do the fraying edges, but you will have a really nice look in the end. So I'm just kind of taking my time fraying those edges. And you may notice when I'm getting to the end here, I have a little tail here. What I can do is fray that tail also. And by fraying that tail, it's also making that wider. So it makes it harder for that last knot to kind of slide off. It's taking up more space. So just take your time. Just take your time. Make sure you're holding those knots as you're doing that fraying. So I'm just going through, fraying my edges, and you can see it doesn't take too terribly long to do it. I'm just using the point of my pencil to kind of brush through each of the cords. Okay, so I have my finished piece. Now, you can leave it like this if you want, or if you decide you want those edges to kind of mirror the other more closely, you can kind of trim it. So I'm going to pull up my tape here. I'll just kind of show how to trim those edges, just so I get more similar look on both sides. You don't have to do this. You can leave it as is. Hmm. So I'm going to flip it over. Since I'm right-handed, I'm going to flip it over and do the same thing. Just kind of trim those edges. And then I have my finished earring. Now, as I said in the beginning, feel free to embellish, add beads, add charms, or pigment. You can see with my examples here, I've kind of changed the colors, painted and dyed the material for different colors. But know that the sky's the limit when it comes to embellishing these pieces. All right, everyone, happy knotting. Have fun with the macrame, and we'll see you soon.